New Zealand sells you a very particular picture of itself. Rolling green paddocks with sheep scattered like punctuation marks. Fiords cut so clean, they look painted. A haka performed for cruise ship passengers who clap on the wrong beat. Vineyards, glaciers, a hobbit hole built for tourists who never read the book. That is the version on the postcard, and it is not wrong, exactly. It is just not the whole country. Underneath that postcard, in valleys, the highway does not reach, and in suburbs that look like any other suburb, until you know what happened behind the fence, New Zealand has spent more than a century producing something the tourism board does not put on a brochure. Communities built on a single man's certainty that he alone understood the truth. Families who handed over their houses, their wages, sometimes their children, to a vision that promised belonging and delivered something else entirely. Some of these places are gone now, bulldozed into subdivisions with cul-de-sac names that erase what came before. Some are still running, right now, while you watch this. There is a reason this keeps happening here, and it is not because New Zealanders are more gullible than anyone else. It is almost the opposite. It is a small, trusting country spread thin across a lot of empty land, where a community can settle into a quiet valley or a suburban street and simply not be noticed for years, sometimes decades, until someone finally finds the courage to walk out and say what actually happened inside. Today, 10 of them, what they believed, what they built, and what got left behind when belief wasn't enough to hold it together. Go on, subscribe, and I'll tell you the whole story. Number 10. The Zenith applied philosophy movement, known to most people simply as ZAP, began in Auckland in the early 1970s as something that looked from the outside almost boring. Personal development seminars, weekend courses promising clearer thinking and better decision-making, the kind of self-improvement pitch that was everywhere in that decade, sold to people who considered themselves too sensible to fall for anything resembling religion. Founded by a man who positioned himself as a rational teacher rather than a spiritual one, ZAP built a following among professionals, business people, people who would have laughed at the word cult if you'd used it to their face. That, more than anything, is what made this one so effective. Nobody walks into a weekend seminar expecting to hand over a decade of their life. The official position for years was that ZAP was simply an education company, registered, taxed, unremarkable. And yet former members who left in the 80s and 90s described a very different internal structure. Escalating financial commitments, a widening gap between members and their families outside the organisation, and a culture where questioning the material was treated as a personal failing rather than a fair response. The Commerce Commission eventually took action against some of ZAP's advertising claims, and public complaints accumulated to the point where the group's reputation in Auckland business circles curdled from respectable to whispered about. Part of what made ZAP different from the communes and compounds later on this list is that nobody was ever asked to move on to a property. Members kept their jobs, kept their houses, kept showing up to work on Monday morning like everyone else. That made the control harder to see from the outside, and, according to several former members, harder to recognise from the inside too. The seminars escalated in cost and intensity gradually, each one framed as the necessary next step toward a clarity the previous course hadn't quite delivered. Families of members have described watching a father or a sister become steadily more distant, more clipped in conversation, more prone to using phrases nobody outside the group understood, while insisting nothing had changed at all. What ZAP left behind isn't a derelict building or a fenced compound. It's harder to photograph than that. It's the quieter legacy of a group that operated almost entirely through language, through seminars, workbooks, terminology that members used with each other, like a private dialect. Some of that vocabulary still surfaces today in unrelated corporate training programs, stripped of its origin, nobody quite remembering where the phrases came from. A movement can disappear as an organisation and still survive as a way certain people learned to think. Whether that counts as an ending is a question nobody in Auckland business circles seems eager to answer. But if a group that never even had an address unsettles you, wait until we get further down this list. because at least one of the communities tonight built entire streets. Number 9. Ananda Marga arrived in New Zealand in the early 1970s as part of a global expansion out of India, presenting itself as a meditation and social service organisation rooted in tantric yoga philosophy. In Auckland and Wellington, small groups of members ran vegetarian cafes, taught yoga classes and did genuine community work, soup kitchens, disaster relief collections, the kind of visible good that made the group difficult to dismiss outright. The history and substance of the movement, though, carried weight from overseas that followed it here. Internationally, Ananda Marga's founder had been convicted, then acquitted on appeal, of conspiracy to murder former members in India, and the organization's global reputation was shadowed by a small number of violent incidents linked to radicalized members in other countries during the 1970s. None of that violence occurred on New Zealand soil, but New Zealand authorities were aware of the group's international file, and Ananda Marga members here operated under a level of scrutiny that most yoga teachers never experience. Wellington's chapter in particular ran one of the more popular vegetarian cafes in the city through the mid-1970s, a place students and public servants alike would drop into for lunch without any real sense that the smiling volunteers behind the counter belonged to an organization that intelligence services in several countries were quietly monitoring, treating a lentil soup counter with the same institutional wariness usually reserved for embassies and dockyards. That's not a small detail. Declassified files from the period, released decades later, confirmed that New Zealand's own security apparatus kept at least a watching brief on the group's local activities, treating a cafe and a yoga hall with a level of institutional caution that would have surprised the regulars queuing for lentil soup. The hidden layer is the gap between the local reality, earnest young New Zealanders doing meditation and charity work in suburban halls, and the international reputation attached to the name they'd adopted. Former members here have generally described their own experience as benign, even beneficial, whether that reflects a genuinely different New Zealand chapter or simply a smaller, quieter branch of something darker elsewhere, is not a question the historical record settles cleanly. The vegetarian cafes are gone now, mostly. What's left is a scattering of older Kiwis who still practice the breathing exercises they learned 40 years ago without necessarily telling their grandchildren where they picked it up. Number 8. The Unification Church, popularly known by the nickname the founder himself despised, and the Moonies, established a presence in New Zealand from the 1970s onward, part of a worldwide network built around the teachings of a Korean religious leader who declared himself the fulfillment of Christian prophecy. In New Zealand, the movement acquired farmland, ran fundraising operations through flower and merchandise sales on city streets, and organised the mass wedding ceremonies the organisation became internationally famous for, matching couples who sometimes met their spouse for the first time at the altar. The official version, presented by the church itself, was always one of family values, world peace initiatives, and interfaith harmony. The reality documented by former members and investigative journalists in multiple countries, New Zealand included, painted a starker picture. Aggressive recruitment of young people, often through front organisations that concealed the Unification Church connection until commitment had already deepened, and family estrangements that lasted decades. Parents around the country spent the 80s hiring so-called deprogrammers to try to extract adult children from the movement's grip, with mixed and sometimes tragic results. One detail that surfaces repeatedly in New Zealand accounts from the period is how ordinary the initial approach usually was. Young members would be invited to a free dinner or a weekend workshop on leadership and world peace, hosted under a name that carried no obvious church affiliation. By the time the Unification Church's actual role became clear, many recruits had already spent a week or more surrounded by warm, attentive new friends, a technique researchers of high control groups have since described as love bombing, and one that made the eventual break from ordinary family life feel less like a decision and more like a drift. Much of the New Zealand Church's property was quietly sold or repurposed as membership numbers declined through the 90s and 2000s. A rural property once used for church retreats near the top of the North Island now operates as an unrelated commercial venture, its previous ownership rarely mentioned in the marketing material. The mass weddings stopped making local headlines. What remains are the individual stories, sons and daughters who came home changed, or who never fully came home at all, and parents who spent years not knowing which version of their child they'd get back on the rare visit. Number 7. In the late 1970s, followers of the Indian spiritual teacher Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later known as Osho, established a meditation center in Auckland as part of the movement's international network of Sannyasin communities. Members wore the distinctive shades of red and orange. The movement was known for worldwide, took new spiritual names, and practiced the intense, often physically expressive meditation techniques Rajneesh had developed, which stood in stark contrast to the quiet, seated meditation most New Zealanders associated with the word. The centre operated as both a spiritual community and, for a period, a genuine business enterprise. Therapy workshops, bodywork sessions, retreats that drew participants from across the country. The wider Rajneesh movement was, by the mid-1980s, embroiled in international scandal following events at the group's Oregon commune in the United States, including a bioterror attack on a local town and criminal charges against senior leadership. New Zealand's small Sannyasin community was geographically and organisationally distant from those events, but the reputational damage travelled regardless, and the Auckland Centre's public profile shifted from curiosity to caution almost overnight. There is a particular kind of local memory attached to this one, the sort that surfaces at dinner parties rather than in newspaper archives. People who grew up in central Auckland in the early 80s still recall seeing small groups of adults in flowing orange and red robes on the street, waiting at bus stops buying groceries, entirely unremarkable except for the colour. For a city that still thought of itself as buttoned down and conservative, it was, by several accounts, the first visible sign that alternative spirituality had arrived on suburban footpaths rather than staying safely overseas. What survived here quietly was smaller and gentler than the scandal that engulfed the movement's headquarters. Some New Zealand members simply continued practicing the meditation techniques independently after the organisational structure dissolved, teaching informal classes that still exist in some form today, disconnected from any reference to their origin. The orange robes are long gone from Auckland streets. What's left is a handful of meditation techniques quietly folded into the city's wellness scene, their provenance mostly forgotten by the people now teaching them. Number 6. The Family International, formerly known as the Children of God, established residential communities, referred to internally as homes, in New Zealand from the 1970s, part of a network that stretched across dozens of countries. The movement combined evangelical Christian theology with a communal lifestyle. Members lived together, pooled resources and raised children collectively within the group structure, largely separated from mainstream schooling and outside social contact. Adult members were also expected to travel frequently between homes in different countries, sometimes with only a few weeks' notice, which meant New Zealand's communities were never quite static, their membership shifting as families arrived from Australia or the Pacific, and moved on again just as quickly. The official history, as the organisation eventually acknowledged after decades of denial, includes a period during the 1970s and 80s in which its founders' teaching sanctioned sexual contact between adults and children within the movement, framed at the time as an expression of spiritual love, free of what the group called worldly hang-ups. New Zealand's homes were part of this global network, and former members who grew up inside the movement here have since given accounts, some through formal legal processes overseas, describing childhoods shaped by those teachings. Children raised inside New Zealand's homes were typically educated within the community itself, using materials produced by the organisation's international leadership, which meant a childhood largely without independent contact with teachers, doctors, or extended family outside the movement, who might have noticed something was wrong. That isolation, more than any single doctrine, is what former members describe as the hardest thing to explain to people who didn't live it. Not one dramatic event, but years of a childhood with almost no outside reference point for what normal was supposed to look like. The Family International renounced the specific doctrines in question in the 1980s, and underwent significant internal reform, eventually dissolving its communal structure entirely in 2010. New Zealand's homes closed along with the rest, their properties sold, their communal furniture and shared vehicles dispersed into ordinary suburban life. What's left is a generation of New Zealanders now in their 40s and 50s who grew up inside a childhood most of their neighbours knew nothing about, quietly rebuilding ordinary lives out of an upbringing that was anything but. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help and that they make sense. It costs nothing, and it tells me this kind of research is worth continuing. Number 5. In 1941, a small group of Christian pacifists established the Riverside community on farmland at Lower Moutere, near Nelson, refusing conscription into the Second World War on religious grounds and choosing instead to build a self-sufficient collective built around shared work, shared meals, and shared conviction. Unlike almost every other name on this list, Riverside is not a cautionary tale. It is still there. The Moutere hills around Nelson were, at the time, home to a scattering of small, independent Baptist and pacifist households, already uneasy with the direction the country was taking. And Riverside grew out of that existing local network rather than arriving as an outside imposition, which likely helped it settle into the wider community without the suspicion that met almost every other name on this list. The community's substance was practical from the beginning. Dairy farming, orcharding, later a winery that became one of the region's respected small producers, combined with a governance structure built around consensus decision-making rather than a single charismatic leader, which is, historians of intentional communities generally agree, one of the clearest predictors of whether a communal experiment survives its founder or collapses without him. Riverside's founding pacifists have long since passed on, and the community that exists today looks quite different in its daily texture, more diverse in belief, less strictly religious in its founding Baptist sense. But the underlying structure, land held in common, decisions made together, no single figure whose word overrides the group, has proven remarkably durable across more than 8 decades. Members who join Riverside today go through a lengthy trial membership process, sometimes years long, before being admitted as full shareholders in the community's land and assets, and any member can leave at any time, taking an agreed financial settlement with them, rather than walking away with nothing, which stands in stark contrast to almost every other name on tonight's list. Visitors are welcomed rather than screened out, and the community's winery and orchard operate as recognizable local businesses, selling into the same shops as their non-communal neighbors down the road. There is no hidden layer here in the way the other items on this list have one. Riverside's history is unusually well documented and unusually free of the abuse allegations, financial exploitation, and charismatic control that define most of the other entries tonight, which raises its own quiet question. If a community built on shared conviction and shared land can run for 80 years without curdling into something harmful, what exactly made the difference between Riverside and Gloriavale, Centrepoint, and the rest? The answer, as far as anyone can tell, comes down to power, who holds it, and whether the structure allows one person to hold too much of it for too long. Number 4. In 1969, the poet James K. Baxter, one of New Zealand's most significant literary figures, walked away from a comfortable literary career and established a commune at Hiruhārama, known in English as Jerusalem, a small Catholic mission settlement on the banks of the Wanganui River. Baxter, who had converted to Catholicism and adopted a self-consciously ascetic lifestyle, invited young people struggling with drug addiction, homelessness, and disconnection from mainstream society to join him in a life of prayer, manual labor, and communal simplicity. The history here is genuinely complicated by real generosity alongside real dysfunction. Baxter's commune operated with the blessing, if not always the comfort, of the local iwi and the Catholic mission whose land it occupied, and it functioned for a period as one of the only accessible drug rehabilitation options available anywhere in the country, at a time when formal treatment services barely existed. Baxter himself wrote extensively about the community's struggles, poverty, disorganisation, the strain of caring for people in genuine crisis with almost no resources, with a self-awareness that most cult founders on this list never demonstrated. The relationship between Baxter's arrivals and the small existing community at Jerusalem was never entirely comfortable. The mission had its own long history and its own rhythms, and the sudden influx of troubled young pakeha from the cities, some in active withdrawal from drugs, tested the patience of a settlement that had not asked to become a rehabilitation centre. Baxter wrote about this tension honestly in his own journals, aware that his presence was, in some ways, an imposition on a place and a community that existed long before he decided it suited his vision of a simpler life. The commune did not survive Baxter's death from a heart attack in 1972. Without his presence, the loose structure he had held together through sheer personal magnetism and poetic authority dissolved within months. What's left at Jerusalem today is largely what was there before Baxter arrived. The mission buildings, the river, a small settlement that has returned mostly to quiet. A modest memorial acknowledges Baxter's time there. The deeper legacy is harder to locate, scattered among people now in their 70s who spent a formative, chaotic season of their lives on that riverbank, credited by some with saving them and blamed by others for very little structure at all. Number 3, the exclusive Brethren, more formally known today as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, established congregations across New Zealand from the 19th century onward. But it is the movement's modern era, marked by increasingly strict separation from the outside world, that has generated the most sustained public controversy. Members are taught to avoid social contact with non-members wherever possible, including, in the most rigid interpretations, close relationships with family members who leave the church. The official position of the church has consistently been that its practices reflect sincere religious conviction and that criticism amounts to religious discrimination. The documented reality, gathered from decades of testimony by former members, describes a practice known as withdrawing or shutting up, in which a member who leaves, or is expelled, is treated as functionally dead by remaining family, with parents, siblings, and even spouses cutting off all contact, sometimes permanently. The church attracted national political controversy in 2005 when it was revealed that members had funded an anonymous political pamphlet campaign against the Green Party during a general election. Despite the church's own teaching that members should not vote or participate in politics, an apparent contradiction the church later acknowledged and apologized for. The episode briefly made an otherwise deliberately low-profile church the subject of front-page coverage, prime-time interviews, and a parliamentary inquiry, an intensity of scrutiny the movement had spent generations quietly avoiding. Unlike most groups on this list, the Brethren run their own schools, largely separate from the mainstream education system, and members are generally discouraged from pursuing higher education or careers that would require sustained contact with non-members. Businesses owned by Brethren families, however, are common and often prosperous, operating in trades like engineering and construction, where members can work primarily alongside each other. The community's wealth, built up over generations of tightly controlled internal commerce, sits at odds with the public image of a persecuted minority the church sometimes presents in media statements. If you've noticed something about a Brethren community near where you live that I haven't covered here, I'd genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and this is a group whose current practices are still very much a live issue rather than settled history. What the Brethren have left behind and continue to leave behind are severed families still living in the same small towns, sometimes on the same street, unable or unwilling to speak to each other. The silence between them a kind of monument nobody chose to build. Number 2. The Centrepoint community was established in 1977 on a rural property in Albany, then well outside Auckland's urban sprawl, by a man named Bert Potter, who framed the community as a radical experiment in encounter therapy, communal living, and what he called liberation from conventional sexual and social norms. At its peak, several hundred people lived on the property across a cluster of purpose-built houses, drawn by promises of psychological healing and freedom, from the repression Potter argued mainstream society enforced on everyone. The history and substance of Centrepoint are unusually well documented, because much of it ended up in a courtroom. Bert Potter was convicted in 1992 on multiple charges relating to the sexual abuse of children within the community, alongside drug supply offences, and served time in prison. Subsequent investigations and civil claims by former child residents revealed a pattern of systemic abuse extending well beyond Potter himself, embedded in a community culture that had normalised adult-child sexual contact under the language of openness and liberation. Centrepoint formally dissolved in the year 2000, and the property was subdivided and sold for residential development. Centrepoint's founding philosophy borrowed heavily from the encounter group movement, popular in parts of the United States during the 60s and 70s, which encouraged participants to break down social inhibitions through confrontational group therapy sessions, often intensified by the recreational drug use that was widespread and, for a period, effectively normalized on the property. That combination, psychological vulnerability, deliberately induced, then compounded by drugs, inside a closed community with no outside oversight, created exactly the conditions in which the abuse later documented in court was able to continue for years before it was stopped. Where the community once stood, ordinary suburban houses now sit on streets with names that give no indication of what occurred there. Former child residents, now adults in their 40s and 50s, have spoken publicly in the years since about growing up inside an environment where the adults responsible for protecting them were, in many cases, the ones causing harm, and about the particular difficulty of building trust in adulthood after a childhood where every boundary had been deliberately erased. The buildings are gone. The people who grew up inside them are still here, still working out what was taken from them, in suburbs that used to be paddocks, and before that was something much darker. If that one unsettles you, brace yourself, because the last place on this list isn't a memory at all. It's still standing. Number 1. Gloriavale Christian Community was founded in 1969 by a New Zealander-born Neville Cooper, who took the name Hopeful Christian, establishing what began as a small evangelical community and grew over more than 5 decades into a closed settlement of several hundred people at Haupiri, deep in the West Coast bush, largely cut off from the outside world by geography and by design. Unlike every other name on this list, Gloriavale is not a memory. It is operating right now, tonight, while this video plays. The community presents itself as a devout Christian family living according to biblical principles: modest dress, communal ownership of property, large families, and an internal economy built on the labour of its own members who work in the community's commercial ventures, a sawmill, a dairy operation, a construction business, without receiving individual wages in the conventional sense. That is the official version, and for decades it was largely the only version that reached the public. The hidden layer has emerged gradually through former members who left at considerable personal cost and spoke publicly about what life inside actually involved. Allegations of sexual abuse spanning decades, a pattern the founder himself was convicted of before his death in 1995. A culture of arranged and pressured marriages beginning at very young ages, and more recently, formal legal findings by the Employment Relations Authority and subsequent court rulings that Gloriavale's labour practices amounted to unlawful exploitation, with members working from childhood without pay, without independent bank accounts, and without meaningful freedom to leave without losing contact with their entire family and community in a single stroke. The community has continued operating throughout these findings, adjusting some practices while disputing others, and continues to attract new members even as a growing number of former members build public lives on the outside, some for the first time in their adult lives holding a bank account in their own name. Geography has always done a great deal of Gloriavale's work for it. Haupiri sits well off the main West Coast highway, hours from the nearest town of any size, surrounded by dense bush and the kind of weather that makes an unplanned exit genuinely difficult without a vehicle, money, or somewhere to go. Former members who have since spoken publicly describe a childhood with almost no exposure to the outside world beyond church-sanctioned television and radio. no independent access to money even in early adulthood, and marriages arranged or heavily encouraged by community leadership at ages that would raise immediate concern anywhere else in the country. Those who leave often do so with a single bag, no qualifications recognized outside the community, and a family they may never speak to again. Whether Gloriavale changes meaningfully in response to the legal findings against it, or simply weathers the scrutiny the way it has weathered scrutiny for 50 years, is a question nobody outside its gates can answer with certainty. What Gloriavale leaves behind, item by item, is not a demolished building or a subdivided paddock. It's a slow trickle of people walking out through the same gate, one at a time, into a country they were raised to believe was dangerous, carrying almost nothing, and starting again. 10 places, 10 different promises of belonging. What strikes me, looking at all of them together, is how similar the opening chapter always sounds. A founder who seemed to offer clarity in a confusing world, a group of people genuinely searching for something more than the ordinary life on offer, and a community that, in its earliest days, probably felt like relief. The harm, when it came, rarely announced itself. It arrived slowly, wrapped in language about freedom or family or truth, until the people inside couldn't easily tell where the promise ended and the control began. New Zealand likes to think of itself as a small, sensible, well-governed place where this sort of thing shouldn't take root. And yet it has, again and again, in paddocks and suburbs a short drive from wherever you're sitting right now, precisely because it is small and trusting and easy to disappear into if nobody comes looking. Riverside sits alongside the other 9 tonight almost as a control group, proof that shared land and shared conviction are not, on their own, the problem. The problem is always the same single ingredient, one person allowed to hold too much power over too many lives, for too long, with nobody watching closely enough to ask why. The buildings come down, or they don't. Some are subdivided into cul-de-sacs. Some are still standing behind a locked gate on the west coast tonight, lights on. Families inside who have never known anything else. The people who walked out are still walking, most of them, still working out what they lost, and what, against all odds, they managed to keep. If there is a lesson in any of this, it probably isn't about New Zealand at all. It's about how ordinary the beginning of every single one of these stories sounds, right up until it wasn't, and how long it can take, sometimes a whole lifetime, for the people caught inside to find the door and actually walk through it. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourself.